I am live. I'm reading The Laird and the Lady. It is a novel by Joan Marshall Grant. She passed away in 1989, and she wrote generally books about her previous lives, her previous incarnations. However, this one is a very interesting novel about romance, ghosts, castles. It's the story of Marylda and Rowan, who meet in a French chateau and had quite an adventurous time. They are now married very quickly, and things appear to Marylda in the Castle Cloud in the Highland of Scotland, where they are now. We are in the third part of this book, and this is the second chapter, and it's entitled Second Shot. During the first week of November, Marylda went over to Darwin with Rowan and Georgina, who were to shoot Caper Caisley with Alistair. Caper Caisley, I think it is, with Alistair. The last stand of the day was in an open glade of the pine woods, and the light of the setting sun seemed almost solid between the sombre trees. Marylda, balanced on a shooting stick beside Rowan, was a little bored, and wondered idly whether Emilie had ever been here with Hector. She had been surprised that only at certain times was it easy to share experience with Emilie, until she learned that the shift of attention never occurred unless she happened to be thinking of an almost identical situation. Since her fall into the river, she had tried to be careful never to become so caught up in the other woman's pattern that she echoed it instead of remaining only the intent observer. There was only one occasion when this had failed. She had been sitting on the window seat of her bedroom, polishing her nails, when Mrs. MacTaggart came up to ask for the orders for dinner. It was only when Marylda saw the cook's astonishment that she realized she had dictated a menu of 7 courses, which belonged to the capacious days of Mrs. Beeton. She had pretended it was a joke, that she had been reading one of the old cookery books that collected dust on a high shelf in the servants' hall. Mrs. MacTaggart stayed to gossip and departed contentedly, with the assurance that the coquelette soup, the roast venison, and red currant jelly, the cheese straws on which she had already decided, would prove satisfactory. Lean back a little. Relax. Not too much, or you'll topple over. Yes, it was working very well. If she looked down, she might see the clothes that Emilie had worn. Would it be the tweed knickerbockers that she had so daringly chosen for the river? No, it was a skirt, sage green cloth with a leather hem. Even with a skirt so short that it showed the second button of her boots, it often got draggled with mud when she followed Hector over plough. The leather had been Julie's idea. It was smart and so much easier to sponge clean than fabric. Not that it really mattered if Julie had to do rather more than was strictly necessary. The last time Hector shot caper, he took a white owl by mistake. She had it stuffed to remind him not to be so impatient when someone mistook a grey hen for a grouse. Hector insisted on putting it on the dining room mantelpiece, which was most tiresome of him, for it spoiled her arrangement of dyed pampas grass and varnished bulrush that looked so well in the Chinese vases. It was exceedingly tiresome to have to provide an admiring audience for Hector, but if she didn't come with him, he'd ask Georgina instead. A castle in Scotland was not really so exciting as she had expected. In winter, it would be deadly dull unless she could persuade Hector to include some of her friends in his house parties. Papa had warned her that she might find a Scot a tough proposition, and suggested rather crudely that if she wanted a title, an Italian count or an Austrian baron might be a better bargain. But she wanted Hector. She still wanted him, and even if she didn't, she would never let anyone know, least of all Papa, who, as the elegantly expressed it, had no sympathy for a sucker. Perhaps Hector would be easier to manage when he knew she was having a baby, but she wouldn't tell him yet. Even if he fussed over her, she would never be sure that it wasn't only because he was anxious, that nothing should interfere with the well-being of his heir. He might even refuse to let her wear corsets, for already he had made sarcastic remarks about women who tight-laced, and then were surprised when they got out of breath if they tried to walk uphill at a reasonable pace. She would never be able to get into the dress Worth had made for the New Year's Eve ball unless she laced. She could tell Hector afterwards, when there was nothing to be done about it, except resign herself to 5 months of boredom. The least he could do after she'd given him an heir would be to take her to London for the season. And of course it would be a boy. It would be quite devastating to produce a girl and have to go through it all again. And he'd probably insist on calling it Georgina. I shall get Hetty Lovell to come over and be the nurse. No, she probably have to be the nursemaid until she learns how a British nanny behaves. Hetty is the only one of the servants at home who was really sorry when I married abroad. She thinks I'm wonderful, and the servants here are worse snobs than Hector's friends. It's very lucky that none of them can afford to despise my money, or the things it buys. I thought Hector would be pleased with the gates. I didn't mean to tell him how much they cost, but he had to be made to realize that I have the grand manner too, that it's not only modern things I can appreciate. The gates cost $5,000, a ridiculous price for an old iron. But I said I wanted the best that money could buy. I learned their pedigree by heart to impress Hector, even the dates of the various families who might have visited a villa near Florence, where they had been for over 300 years. But he only laughed and said if spending money amused me, it was none of his business so long as I didn't do anything too drastic to Cloud. So I had to insist on the new wing, to make him believe that everything I'm doing here is an improvement. I don't think he'd have let me build it unless I had pointed out that he would be deliberately refusing employment to his precious Highlanders. My son will be called the Master of Credulity. I shan't allow Hector to bully him. He ought to be very good-looking. It's lucky I didn't marry an ugly man, for children sometimes take after their fathers. It's odd, but since I started this baby, I don't like seeing things killed. If I told Hector, he might say it was pity I didn't inherit a stronger stomach from grandfather, who began his fortune in the Chicago meat market. But of course Papa doesn't have anything to do with that side of the business. It takes a Scottish aristocrat to enjoy killing his own meat. A roe deer trotted out of the shelter of the dark trees, stood with one foot lifted to sniff the evening wind. Behind him the hind waited, a fawn at her side. A gun shattered their security. The stag sank slowly to his knees, his head turning from side to side, in a last despairing effort to find the source of the danger which threatened his family. A girl ran across the glade to kneel by the dying animal. The man who had fired the shot tried to lift her to her feet. She hit him across the face. "You filthy murderer," she cried out hysterically. Then, before he could answer either to comfort or condemn, she fled from him into the woods. Rowan turned on his heel and strode off in the opposite direction. "Damned extraordinary thing," said Alistair to Georgina. "Only other time I saw a woman behave like that was when Emilie slapped Hector, and now I come to think of it, that unfortunate exhibition took place here too." What happened afterwards? Alistair tried to remember. Where did Emilie go? Odd for Georgina to sound so worried, bound to be a bit upset at her grandson's wife making such a disgusting scene, but she ought to be angry instead of fussed. So far as I remember, she went off home in a car with that sofa fella. Hector stayed with us for a couple of days, gloomed around that place and made a nuisance of himself. You mustn't blame Marylda. It's not her fault that she is Emilie's niece. He patted her on the shoulder. Getting very tolerant in your old age, aren't you, my dear? Hope Rowan takes the same view. Always sorry to see young people making a mess of their lives. Keep Rowan for dinner. Tell him I've got a slight headache. And Marylda has driven me home. Say that I want to see him immediately he gets back. You've got that quite clear. Immediately he gets back. This was the Georgina he understood. Brisk, authoritative. He made a mock salute. Very good, milady. Any further orders? No, that's all. But for God's sake, don't make a muddle. He laughed. I'll try. As I'm 5 years older than you, I may possibly have reached the years of discretion. But I like being bullied by you. Makes me feel the young cub you were always too busy to notice. When Georgina was out of his sight, she began to run. Had Marylda gone down to the road? If she was still thinking as Emilie, she might be hit by a car. Cars went so much faster than they did 50 years ago. Would she remember slapping Rowan? She hadn't said anything about Emilie until she was dreaming about it after the fishing accident. Somehow they must try to convince her that nothing odd had happened. The poor child would be so ashamed if she knew what she'd done. She reached a gate and could look down across a ploughed field to the lane where their car and the shooting brake were parked. Marylda was sitting on the running board of the Alvis smoking a cigarette. She saw Georgina and waved, and the elder woman hurried towards her. Rowan's staying to dinner, but do you mind driving me home? I've a bit of a headache. Of course not, darling. I'm feeling a bit wilted too. It's been a long day, and the midges were monstrous. She can't remember otherwise. She'd be worried about Rowan, thought Georgina. But I wish she wouldn't drive quite so fast. What would happen if she suddenly got caught up in Emilie's while she was driving? The speedometer flickered between 60 and 70. Thank God Emilie never learned to drive, thought Marylda. I wouldn't sound very convincing if I'd said in a polite court that I'd jammed on the brakes and skidded because I was afraid of running over a man with a red flag. I must be more careful at letting myself tune in to my dear aunt. I think that stopped because the battery is low. I do the last sentence again. She can't remember, otherwise she'd be worried about Rowan, thought Georgina. But I wish she wouldn't drive quite so fast. What would happen if she suddenly got caught up in Emilie while she was driving? The speedometer flickered between 60 and 70. Thank God Emilie never learned to drive, thought Marylda. I wouldn't sound very convincing if I said in a polite court that I'd jammed on the brakes and skidded because I was afraid of running over a man with a red flag. I must be more careful at letting myself tune in to my dear aunt. When I ran off to avoid seeing the Garloch, I almost believed I'd hit Rowan. In fact, let's face it, until Georgina appeared, I was not at all sure that I hadn't echoed Emilie far too solidly. Georgina would be furious if I'd made a scene, so it's obvious that nothing awful happened. But I'd better make quite sure. I might have said something. Rowan wasn't peeved that I sloped off by myself after the last drive. How fortunate I've become such an expert liar, thought Georgina. I don't think he'd noticed you'd gone. He was looking for a bird that had fallen rather far back. You mean after he shot the roe deer? She accelerated to conceal her agitation. Had she asked the wrong question? Did the deer belong only to Emilie's time? Georgina hesitated. And so will I, because I think the battery is empty. I stop this here. Today is Friday, the 7th of June 2024.